One of my favorite poets is Joy Harjo. Joy Harjo is a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation. She writes in her poem, "Perhaps the World Ends Here." I can't read you all the stanzas, but I want to give you a little flavor of the poem. It begins that the world begins at a kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to live. She says of that table that it is here that children are given instructions on what it means to be human. That wars have begun and ended at this table. It's a place to hide in the shadow of terror, a place to celebrate the terrible victory. We've given birth on this table and have prepared our parents for burial here. At this table we sing with joy, with sorrow, we pray of suffering and remorse, we give thanks. And she ends by writing, "Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table, while we are laughing and crying, eating of the last sweet bite." This morning, Reverend Leslie shared a number of stories of women who persisted. Indigenous poet Joy Harjo, in those lines of her poem, remind me of everyday persistence. Persistence necessary in raising children, caring for elders, and living, yes, living in the shadow of terror. The poem, as you can see, "Perhaps the World Ends Here," is obviously eschatological. Now let me explain. Eschatological. Eschatology comes from the Greek eschatos, which means last, eschatos, last, and logi is simply the study of. So eschatology is the study of the last. It's the theological study of the understanding of how the world might end, the final events of history. Maybe it's a sign of the times that the popularity of eschatology in television and movies and books has seemed ever increasing. Maybe you have found yourself binge watching the zombies of The Walking Dead or other zombie apocalypse types of shows. Last year there was a movie released called First Reformed. Ethan Hawke plays the pastor of a small Dutch Reformed church in upstate New York. His character is undergoing a severe spiritual and psychological crisis. You see, among other things, his character is pastoring to a family that is racked with worry over global warming and deciding not to bring a baby into the world because of climate change. This movie's plot is a striking and unfortunately relevant statement about the effects of global warming, one that many of us are considering even off of the silver screen. Climate change and the uncertainty surrounding it is hardly just fodder for big screen entertainment. We are learning that it is a reality that is taking a toll on people's mental and spiritual health. As global climate change continues to get worse, therapists are reporting that people are beginning to come to their offices expressing a multitude of anxiety and fear about climate change. You see, global climate change is real. We experience the consequences. Just last week, a few weeks ago, the so-called atmospheric river dumping moisture in amounts that we're not as used to. Fires this previous summer that had some of us walking around with N95 masks on to protect ourselves from the particulate matter. And while we experience this here, Australia has recorded its hottest January ever on record, temperatures soaring to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 weeks never going below 104 degrees Fahrenheit. We've reached a tipping point where significant climate change is inevitable, and much of it is out of our control. And from what I have researched, the consequences will be devastating. And yet I still find it hard to act. You see, we hear the theories like the ones of the atmospheric rivers are getting worse by changes in ocean temperature. They seem rather complicated to me. They either or ambiguous or just not as immediate threat to my everyday existence. I hear numbers like 350 parts per million and may not understand the reference to a safe level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere being 350 parts per million. In fact, then I learned that we've passed that and we're now going past 400 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You know, it's hard to connect in one's mind how that gas that you can't see or smell is having such a devastating impact. Yeah, climate change will happen. It will impact our lives. We may not be able to stop it or even slow it down, and still part of our religious commitment is to continue to persist, to work to do just that with hope and with commitment. Yet even in our work, we still must struggle with, and we are being forced to struggle with, how to cope, adjust, both physically, emotionally, and spiritually to the inevitable ramifications of climate change. There's a new field of psychology developing that is considering how we tend to the mental and emotional dimensions of climate change. This here is Kate Shapira of Providence, Rhode Island. In 2014, she set up this booth in a local park. Her sign reads, "Climate Anxiety Counseling, 5 cents, the doctor is in." Of course, a tongue-in-cheek reference and homage to Charles Schulz Peanut's character, Lucy, and her psychiatric help booth. Kate Shapira says of the motivation to open this booth in a local park, she says, "I was just feeling very terrible and helpless, and also feeling like in the terribleness and helplessness, I didn't feel capable of articulating those feelings. I didn't have a good way of talking about climate change with people that acknowledged its seriousness and its direness and the direness of its effects and how I was feeling about those things. So this is just a way that I made up to try to break down that isolation and maybe build a shared vocabulary around climate change and climate anxiety." Journalist Jeremy Deaton writes that Shapira has struggled to find a way to talk about climate change that acknowledges the enormity of the problem without leaving people feeling helpless. While she is committed to the fight, pointing visitors to opportunities for local action, she also struggles with feelings of powerlessness. She's profoundly worried about the future, so much so that she has decided not to have children, fearing what climate change will bring. One day she met a young man at her booth who said he believed he only had 5 years to live. Not because he was sick, not because anything was wrong with him, but because he believed that life on earth will become impossible for humans. The conversation actually ended with Shapira and him sitting on the ground together, holding hands and crying, which is not something that she usually does. She says that was a hard day. A psychologist by the name of Renee Lertzman, who studies the mental and emotional dimensions of climate change, believes that few people have managed to process their grief about the slow decay of life on Earth. She said that many people are caught in a state of arrested mourning, what she has labeled environmental melancholia. The reason why I think we have a pervasive environmental melancholia is directly related to the fact that we're not really talking about this, she says. While psychologists have developed ways of grappling with the death of a family member or the loss of a job, experts are still learning how to dislodge anxieties about climate change. Lertzman recommends talking, which allows us to increase our ease with what is or may come. I want religious communities like this one to be locations in our lives where we can engage our spiritual practices of deep listening and deep sharing with one another, creating the capacities we have to hear and to be heard. It is our responsibility and covenant to ensure that no one of us is alone with the anxiety that comes with thinking about the impacts of these changes. So as psychologists consider our emotional and psychological health through these changes, we as religious communities must do the work to address the spiritual and pastoral ramifications of unprecedented change. This is a really hard sermon for me to write. It's even harder to preach. You see, I feel like as a religious leader, my default stance must always be hope. I must always come to you with joy and to leave you with that sense of joy and with hope. I want you to know you. I want you to know that we can change, that we can stem this. I want for all of us to internalize our ability and the possibility that human behavior will change so significantly that the literal and existential threat of global climate change will be eradicated. And yet, still often I despair. I read, and my research suggests that it may be too late. And therefore, sometimes I just find it easier not to talk about it, not to talk about climate change. Maybe it seems similar, I think, to how some of us behave with people we love who are in deep grief at losing someone they have loved. Maybe you, like me, have thought that just avoiding talking about their loss would be better. You know, we imagine that by talking about their grief, by talking about that loved one who is gone, we'll bring up their grief again, and it'll be our fault. Not understanding that ignoring our beloved's pain for fear of making it worse really does make it worse. I've heard from those who have experienced loss wonder why the person they loved who is now dead is now persona non grata. No one will talk about them or their loss. You see, Katharine Hayhoe, in a recent TED Talk, speaks of this issue of our silence. She's referring to a study at Yale University that looks at this issue of climate change in science. She says, and then when you ask people, do you ever talk about climate change? 2/3 of people in the entire United States said never. And even worse, when you say, do you hear the media talk about this? Over 3/4 of people say, no. So it's a vicious cycle. The planet warms, heat waves get stronger, heavy precipitation gets more frequent, hurricanes get more intense, scientists release yet another doom-filled report, politicians push back even more strongly, repeating the same science-y sounding myths. Hayhoe continues, what can we do to break this vicious cycle? The number one thing we can do is the exact thing that we're not doing. Talk about it. But you might say, oh, well, I'm not a scientist. How am I supposed to talk about radiative forcing or cloud parameterization in climate models? Well, we don't need to be talking about more science. We've been talking about the science for over 150 years. Did you know that it's been 150 years or more since the 1850s when climate scientists first discovered that digging up and burning coal and gas and oil is producing heat-trapping gases that is wrapping an extra blanket around the planet? That's how long we've known. It's been 50 years since scientists first formally warned a U.S. president of the dangers of changing climate. The president was Lyndon B. Johnson. So if we aren't supposed to talk about more science, or if we don't need to talk about more science, then what should we be talking about? Well, we should be talking about the most important things. We should be talking about what matters to us. We should start not in our heads, but in our hearts. Questions like, are we both parents? Or do we live in the same community? Or do we enjoy the same outdoor activities, hiking, biking, whatever it may be? Do we care about the economy or national security? So if we are meant to talk to each other, can we not start here in religious community? Today I'm going to invite us to risk being the party pooper, the downer, the killjoy, and talk about it. Religious communities must be one locale where we can talk about our feelings, our fears, our despair, and let us find ways to continue to hear and to be heard. We can respond also as religious communities to this anticipated upheaval by having constants, having touchstones that are abiding in our lives. May I suggest that those could be the values to which we subscribe as a religious community, and the existence of the very communities that support us in holding ourselves accountable to those values. All the world may change, but the values to which we subscribe can remain constant. We must persist in affirming and promoting the values that we share. We must persist in ensuring that no one is alone. We must persist in talking about the most painful issues that we would rather ignore and wish that they would just go away. May this church be a manifestation of that kitchen table that Joy Harjo speaks of, writes of. May this be a place where children learn what it means to be human, where we can come broken and put ourselves back together, where we can give thanks, where we can celebrate the lives of those who have died, where we can embrace and be embraced by our dreams, where we can hear and be heard, where we can grieve together, where no one is alone with change. Perhaps the world will end at this table of religious community while we are laughing and crying and eating of the last sweet bite. May it be so.